Good morning, everyone, or good evening, depending on which part of the world you're in. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Errol Southers. I'm the director of the Safe Communities Institute in the Saul Price School of Public Policy at the University of Southern California. I want to thank you for joining us for this incredible book event during Women's History Month. You know, I also especially want to thank those of you who serve at the various levels of government to keep our nation and the world safe. Thank you for your service. So the 9/11 attacks fundamentally transformed how the United States approached terrorism. It yielded an unprecedented expansion of counterterrorism strategies, policies, and practices. Today's book talk on a women's place in United States counterterrorism since 9/11 is developed from extensive primary source interviews and documents tracing the evolution of women's positions in relation to the United States counterterrorism efforts through the administrations of Presidents Bush, Obama, and Trump. But I'm not going to be a spoiler for what's going to be a very riveting presentation and conversation today. Let me go ahead now and just talk about our author. Dr. Joanna Cook is an assistant professor of terrorism and political violence at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs, Leiden University in the Netherlands, and a senior project coordinator and editor-in-chief at the International Center for Counterterrorism, also in the Netherlands. She's an adjunct lecturer at Johns Hopkins University in the United States. Her research focuses primarily on terrorism and counterterrorism with a specialization in the roles of women and gender dynamics. Previously, she was a senior research fellow with the International Center for the Study of Radicalization at King's College in London. Additionally, she worked on an ad hoc basis with organizations such as the Independent Commission for Aid Impact in the UK, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and Public Safety in Canada, and Moonshot CVE and Safer World, amongst others. She received both her PhD and master's from the Department of War Studies in King's College in London in the UK, and a BA from the University of Regina in Canada. Our moderator today is our own Ms. Jessie Redd, who is our academic programs specialist at the Safe Communities Institute. Of course, she's a Trojan. She's got her bachelor's degree from USC, master's degree from Florida International University, where she also has a certificate in Homeland Security, and Jessie runs everything. So I'm delighted to have both of them here today. Delighted you could join us. And without further ado, I give you Dr. Joanna Cook.
I was in my high school cafeteria watching those Twin Towers go down, and the aftermath from that day alone that left about 3,000 citizens from around the world dead. And the events of 9/11 have really since proven to be some of the most formative for the 21st century global landscape. What we've now seen in the aftermath of 9/11 are two wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. We've seen military engagement in dozens of other countries. Old threats like Al-Qaeda have continued to expand their footprint around the world and evolve, and new threats like ISIS have emerged, becoming the most wealthy and successful terrorist group in history. We've seen the US train, equip, and partner with countries around the world to manage terrorism better in their own neighborhoods. And we've also seen extremely problematic and controversial policies and practices engaged throughout this period as well, in some cases only compounding or exacerbating concerns from violent extremism. But despite all of these global efforts, resources, and losses, terrorism has not declined. It's proliferated, it's diversified, it's evolving, and groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS have, in some cases, seen their membership only increase. And though we're at a very different place than 20 years ago, terrorism continues to be at the forefront of the public agenda. The financial and the human costs of this ongoing campaign has also been exponential. So according to the Brown University project, or the Cost of War project, the US has now spent estimates as high as $5.4 trillion in response to the events of 9/11. And if you consider the long-term obligations for veteran medical and disability support, this rolls over $6 trillion. And beyond the nearly 7,000 US servicemen and women who have been killed in action, and then many from those from countries like my own home country of Canada or the UK here, where I am now, who have also lost their lives fighting in these wars. We've seen over 500,000 people also die from war-related violence in countries like Iraq, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. And for me, these figures are still truly hard to fathom. But what this, this campaign is really, this campaign against terrorism has fundamentally impacted how my generation and that coming up now understands concepts like security, terrorism, and what we should do to keep our country safe. But what these now 20 years have also highlighted is just what a significant gap in knowledge, policy, and practice there has been in relation to women in counterterrorism. So there's been an absolute shortfall in tracing and understanding women's roles in this period at every step, or how these have changed. And I argue in the book that there have been significant consequences from it thus far. And so this is the key argument of the book, A Woman's Place, U.S. Counterterrorism Since 9/11, that the global war on terror has impacted on these roles of women in relation to counterterrorism and terrorism in yet largely unrecognized or undocumented ways. And this has really had profound effects on the efficacy, the impacts, and the support of these efforts to prevent, address, and recover from terrorism around the world. In other words, by not fully understanding, supporting, or recognizing women's diverse roles in relation to counterterrorism and the diverse gender dynamics within these has led to flawed or problematic policies and practices. But in this period as well, there are also many positive advances seen in this period and lessons that I think can be carried forward to practices today in relation to counterterrorism. The book demonstrates that it's absolutely imperative to meaningfully engage and consider gender dynamics and women at every step of the way, including as agents, partners, and targets of this work. And this is the so what implication of the book. That women's participation matters to counterterrorism, and it impacts not only the efficacy of these practices, but it also ensures that they reflect the needs and the considerations of women in that society and in those forces, and also emphasizes a human rights compliant approach to counterterrorism, which does not in fact violate women's rights unintentionally. The book has developed a framework specific for academics, policymakers, and practitioners to better assess how, where, and why women may be emphasized in relation to counterterrorism policy and practice. And this allows us, I think, to better highlight problematic gender stereotypes or assumptions, and to really work with partners to advance women and considerations related to women more effectively in this space. And because it's a university audience, and I know there's some researchers in here as well, I'm going to talk about the framework a little bit and how it might be applicable to some of your own work. So in the book, I look at 9/11 and the subsequent international counterterrorism response by the US through this neglected lens. And as I mentioned, I consider how women have been agents, partners, and targets of counterterrorism in the years since. And so what do I mean by that? When I'm talking about women as agents, I mean women physically working in the US forces and in the US government more broadly. So soldiers, diplomats, aid workers, and so forth who have had an indirect or a direct role in countering terrorism or countering violent extremism. I take a full spectrum approach in this in the book. When I talk about partners, I reference women in foreign countries such as Iraq, Afghanistan, or Yemen that the US works with through foreign governments or otherwise engaged as communities of interest. And by targets, I meant women who are actually members and supporters of these terror groups. So in particular, I look at Al-Qaeda and ISIS. The book asks, where are the women, as inspired by Cynthia Enlow's question, and it examines how, where, and why women became visible in the discourses and the practices related to counterterrorism through this lens of international US efforts from 2001 to early 2019. And it focuses both on US and local women in Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, and Syria. I consider full spectrum approaches, which range from preventative efforts, so P and CVE work, all the way to direct engagement and stabilization and recovery. All activities that were specified as having a direct or complementary role in countering terrorism as defined by the government. So before digging into the findings of the book, a couple quick points about how the book is laid out and the methods I used. So for this, I reviewed about 500 US government documents, including strategies, speeches, and policy reports. I conducted about 40 interviews with senior and mid-level US government employees, civilians, defense personnel, and diplomats for this, all of who had directly informed or worked on these policies and programs. And in the book, I drew off of international relations theories on women, peace, and security, but mostly feminist security studies and terrorism studies. So when we talk about women in policy and practice, it's important to know that we have to recognize that these are almost always gendered. So they can be based on things like idealized gendered roles or assumptions that men and women in this space. And this is the title, the reason the book is titled as it is, Ideas of What a Woman's Place is in Relation to Security. These discourses and these practices can either challenge or reinforce stereotypes. So for example, ideas that men are more efficient soldiers, or that women are often victims instead of agentic actors in their lives or communities, or that mothers versus fathers are better positioned in the family to counter violent extremism. And so by recognizing that all of these discourses and practices are gendered, it does help us better identify, question, and challenge these assumptions to ensure the most efficient, fair, and legitimate approaches to countering terrorism are taken. And so if you want to survey almost 20 years of this, where do you even start? And for me, I started at the presidential administration. So I looked at the speeches, the national security, and the counterterrorism strategies, and other documents which laid out the positions of the offices of Presidents Bush, Obama, and Trump, and their administrations, and how they intended to counter terrorism and how women were envisioned in relation to this. And so while each of these administrations took a unique approach to countering terrorism over their tenure, what was consistent throughout these years was what was referred to as an all-of-government or a comprehensive approach to countering terrorism. And so that's why I include organizations like USAID in this. So this meant not only defense and diplomatic means, while others such as development and economic streams of effort received differing levels of prioritization. And as such, I have a department, or a chapter on the Department of Defense, chapter on Department of State, and one on USAID, as all became key departments of focus within these international efforts. So what I'm going to do now is quickly walk you through the framework in the book to get you thinking a little bit more about how and why and where women became visible in these discourses and practices of counterterrorism. So women were generally referenced in one of the 7 following categories in all of the documents and the interviews that I conducted. And the first category was the most straightforward, security practitioners. So women's formal roles in the armed forces, police, intelligence services, and other security related roles. And so this category viewed women, and particularly American women, in terms of their active roles and contributions to US forces, and were almost without exception, referenced alongside their male colleagues. So they're men and women of US forces. But what was interesting is when you looked at foreign forces, that men and women label often disappeared, suggesting that female security actors and forces the US partnered with in places like Afghanistan and Yemen were viewed distinctly or even negligibly. So the second category was that of conflict prevention, reconciliation, and reconstruction. And so this was based most clearly off of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, the 2000 landmark resolution on women, peace, and security. This category highlighted how women served as actors in preventative or post-conflict efforts, which contributed to state stability and security. So 1325 remained largely neglected until the first US National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security was established in 2011, later influencing department-specific recommendations related to women's roles in counterterrorism. The third category was women's rights, empowerment, and equality. And there were 2 distinguishable streams within this. So women's status in democracy promotion, which tended to emphasize women's legal rights, status, and participation in governance. So for example, training for political leadership, encouraging voter participation, and so forth. And then secondly, a focus on more traditional foreign assistance and humanitarian aid efforts to bolster women's status and emphasizing areas such as education, employment, and health. So women's rights were at times also instrumentalized in the pursuit of counterterrorism, using some of these phrases as well. The fourth category was women as members of the public or the community, which emphasized women's roles in the wider foreign population. And so again, there were 2 streams within this. The first was specific efforts focused on women in the local community and included engagement with women to attain cooperation or partnership or information or support in counterterrorism efforts, intelligence gathering as well in some cases, or which viewed women as access points into their communities, which was particularly relevant when counterinsurgency and stabilization operations were ongoing. The second related to women's positive status in their communities, which was understood to represent good governance and a healthy, stable society more generally, where terrorism was less likely to take hold. The fifth category was the private or domestic sphere, which emphasized women's roles in the family, particularly as mothers and wives. So women were often seen to deter or interject when their loved ones were susceptible to violent extremism. And the category became more emphasized as a CVE, or countering violent extremism, gained prominence. The sixth category was victimhood, which emphasized women as victims in several senses. So in deficits of women's rights, or highlighting women's oppression, or as an indicator of broader challenges and shortfalls in society that made a society more susceptible to extremist appeals. But it also considered women as victims targeted by terrorist violence, particularly in cases of sexual and gender-based violence. And in some cases, saving women was also used to justify or promote counterterrorism practices or interventions. And the seventh category was women as terrorist actors themselves, which highlighted women's roles and status in jihadist groups, primarily Al-Qaeda, but most prominently in ISIS and their affiliates. But while women were still largely viewed as either limited violent terrorist actors or victims duped into joining terrorist organizations, there was a lot of nuance to this category. So these categories are not mutually exclusive, they're not exhaustive, and they often interacted with and informed each other. But what the categories offer us is as a starting point to really help map out where women became visible across that full spectrum of direct and indirect US counterterrorism efforts. While each department drew on multiple categories, the most emphasized were also unique to each department and agency. So how these categories were understood and became visible in practice in relation to counterterrorism also evolved significantly over this period based on several factors. So there was no single factor which informed how or why these categories related to women evolved in US counterterrorism discourses and practices, but they were largely influenced by 8 key factors, and each department or agency was influenced uniquely by these at different points in time. So these generally relate to the specific discourses present in the wider environment at that time, or the discursive milieu, so the discourses that guide and inform practice. There was also the physical operational environments that the US was operating in, or that operational milieu, the locations and contexts the actors operated in, and the mission at hand. And there were also features within each agency itself, the agency milieu. And I think this is one that that's quite overlooked in the literature, in which I had a lot of, I dug into quite a bit over the course of this book. And I'm going to discuss these briefly before highlighting some of the specific examples between 2001 and 2019. So if we look at these international discourses, these included largely UN-generated discourses. So everything from the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, to the Millennium Development Goals, and most importantly, UN Security Council resolutions related to terrorism, and most prominently that of 1325 on women, peace, and security. So these international discourses were important for really shaping the global norms pertaining to women's roles and status in this period as they related to counterterrorism and CVE. The second were national discourses or statements and strategies by US presidential administrations and other high-ranking officials pertaining to women and security at the national level. So these included national security strategies, national strategies for combating terrorism, and other documents which drove interagency cooperation and efforts. And it also considered specific counterterrorism relevant discourses by Presidents Bush, Obama, and Trump in their own speeches and statements. The third were the operational environments the US found itself in, and the unique historical, geopolitical, and sociocultural characteristics of each country or region in which they operated. So for example, the gender segregated nature of countries like Afghanistan, Iraq, and Yemen prompted more female-centric or gender-sensitive responses, where it was more culturally appropriate to have women engaging with other women, particularly in public interactions or sensitive activities such as body searches or interrogations, or in some cases, house raids. So each of these environments had to be assessed in its unique context in terms of how it influenced the shape of US counterterrorism efforts. The fourth factor was the evolving operational objectives, which were prompted by the environments the US was operating within, and the strategy, mission, or program at hand. None of these environments were static, and the situation on the ground in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, and Yemen all changed substantially over the course of the global war on terror. And there were evolving operational objectives, particularly as counterinsurgency concerns started to rise. And so how, where, and why women were engaged was all directly tied to the operational objective of the day, as well as the understood means from which to achieve this. The fifth was how counterterrorism is constructed really depends on how that terrorist threat is perceived. And that includes women-centric actions of terrorist organizations themselves. So for example, when Al-Qaeda in Iraq began using women to smuggle contraband or deploying female suicide bombers around 2007-8, new female units were established to search women at checkpoints and engage them in operations. As women increasingly traveled to Syria to join ISIS, this had to be reflected in CVE programming as well. However, women still appeared to be a lesser consideration when looking at terrorist groups, and male actors remained the primary focus. The sixth was the department or agency's own historical knowledge, consideration of, and emphasis on women and gender in their work. So women tended to be considered more in evolving counterterrorism programming when they had been explicitly mentioned in policy language, or when gender was considered in things like agency planning, frameworks, and evaluations. And the presence of things such as gender advisors, gender coordinators, or other roles where women and gender concerns were prioritized really made a difference, and the levels of support, influence, or access these kind of roles had. The seventh was agency limitations, and this really came up where each agency or department faced distinct operational and bureaucratic limitations or specific gaps in knowledge. So agency limitations saw competition for resources and prioritization, where unless programming was framed as counterterrorism relevant, it often risked being relegated down the chain of funding priorities. And this is something we really saw in some of the development programming that became labeled as CVE work. There was also a paucity in knowledge, in agency knowledge of women's roles in violence, and a limited understanding of the push and pull factors related to women's recruitment into jihadist groups, highlighting gaps in CVE programming. So this became particularly apparent around 2014 when we saw women from around the world going to Iraq and Syria. And a lot of these departments were really playing a catch-up game in terms of understanding what roles women were playing over there and how they could be interjected from travel. The eighth was interagency cooperation and coordination. This factor was apparent where various agencies worked together on certain programs or informed joint practices or initiatives. So the collaboration and interaction between these agencies and different countries and regions of interest was an important aspect to also look at. However, there was often no single platform to facilitate interactions like these, and they varied significantly across region and nature of effort, and were impacted by other considerations, including the personalities and priorities in each location. There was also a limited analysis of how different streams of effort impacted on each other. And there was also limited analysis of how the consequences could come up from this. So for example, if you're running a CVE program, what was the impact of that when you had direct counterterrorism operations occurring in the same region? So looking at things like civil military relations, joint gender advisory groups, joint gender training or joint training exercises, personnel exchanges, all of these points became relevant to the interagency cooperation and coordination, which also informed the roles of women in this space. And the very last component of the framework I devised was the justifications often stated to include women. And there were three prominent discourses that were frequently referenced to justify how and why women should be engaged in counterterrorism efforts. And these proved important for understanding the different motivations for including women in each agency or department. So the first justification frequently cited was the perceived increased operational benefits, innovation, and effectiveness achieved by including women. So here, women's inclusion in new ways, such as in new roles or units or programming, was highlighted as making counterterrorism-related initiatives more effective. The second justification was that based on a rights approach, and this saw three manifestations. So the first was the assertion that women had the right to be able to equally participate in all aspects of society, including security and as such counterterrorism. So this was sometimes viewed along a specific standard required in that agency. So in other words, as an equal member of society, as long as a woman could achieve that agency standard. So for example, a physical requirement in the DoD, then it was her right to participate in any role. The second embodiment of this here was women's rights, which were viewed as those most negatively impacted by terrorist violence and the broader insecurity that may accompany this. And as such, it was crucial that women be included in formulating and implementing responses to them. This also ensured the program did not, in fact, violate the rights unintentionally when gender-specific impacts were not accounted for, which were recognized to promote more effective counterterrorism approaches. And third, the status of women's rights and equality was also viewed in that democratic sense as an indicator of broader state stability, where positive democratic states were less likely to foster extremism. So women who had rights and were empowered were also understood to be able to more efficiently contribute to counterterrorism efforts, and their rights should thus be prioritized as part of that democratic-centric approach. So these various rights approach discourses were utilized to advance women's roles in counterterrorism, to protect women in practice, and to use flourishing women's rights as an indication of a society resilient to extremism. And the third and final justification was that of the half the population approach, where women's inclusion was justified by virtue of their representing 50% of the population. This category has suggested that gender as a social construct shaped the roles and experiences of men and women in society differently, where women could bring unique perspectives, ideas, or experiences to the table. As such, in order to have the most robust approach to direct and indirect counterterrorism efforts, the gendered roles, experiences, and perspectives of the other half of the population had to be recognized and reflected in policy language and programming. Sustainable peace also increasingly demanded the buy-in and consideration of diverse and traditionally neglected groups, such as women, youth, or minority populations, to ensure the longevity of those approaches, where women's representation gained particular emphasis. So what these categories, the factors that impacted these, and the justifications stated for including women offer us is a framework or a map for better identifying how and where women were emphasized in relation to US counterterrorism efforts, as well as the reasons it may have changed or been encouraged in the first place. While I look at the case of the US in the book, I believe the framework is flexible enough to consider women's roles in relation to counterterrorism in other settings around the world. But there was a lot more focus on the actual practices as well here. And so there's a lot of notable examples from each of these departments of focus. But some of the ones that I looked at include the following. So in the Department of Defense, this included new programs like Team Lioness that was established in Iraq, or female engagement teams, cultural support teams, or programs that were developed as the US faced new challenges in the field, such as growing insurgencies, and had to overcome a lack of capability to engage that other half of the population in their counterinsurgent efforts, and thus better engage women in local communities. This was also prompted, as seen in Iraq, with the increasing number of female suicide bombers and women in militant and insurgent forces. There was also increased focus on training and equipping women in foreign security forces. So the book looks at programs that were established and engaged and impacted local women, such as the development of an all-elite female training counterterrorism force in Yemen, or special security forces established in Afghanistan with women from those countries, or programs like the Daughters of Iraq program, the kind of sister program to the Sons of Iraq program, which many of you are probably familiar with. It also considers how these roles were increasingly opening up all positions, including combat positions, to the 250,000 US women who served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and broader US forces, based on the diverse roles that they had in this period. But I also look at some of the dubious cases of women as security practitioners in this period. So those, for example, of Lindy England, who became infamous for the abuse of prisoners in Abu Ghraib, or controversies around the media coverage of POW Private Jessica Lynch. When I look at the Department of State, I looked at programs that focused on women's rights and empowerment through that lens of democracy promotion, where democratic societies were understood as the most resilient against terrorist appeals. So it discusses programs like the Middle East Partnership Initiative, where women's political participation and empowerment was framed in relation to countering extremism in countries like Yemen. It looks at shifts in the State Department to start thinking more about how they can engage women better in civil society in CVE efforts, or promote women more in policing in relation to countering terrorist groups. It also considered women in the development of the first National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, which began emphasizing women in all aspects of foreign policy, steps to elevate diplomacy and development in full spectrum counterterrorism efforts, considered alongside that 3D approach with defense, and increasing partnership with the DoD in interagency counterterrorism relevant initiatives. In the chapter on USAID, it considers how an agency largely viewed once outside of the sphere of security became viewed as increasingly integral to this fight against terrorism, as links between things like development and security became more emphasized, particularly in preventive or countering violent extremism efforts, so PCV efforts, challenging what are referred to as the underlying drivers of extremism. Here, issues as diverse as women's education and health became highlighted in terms of their contributions to countering terrorism. And it looked at the increasing interaction of civil military actors during reconstruction and stabilization work, for example, where expensive gender knowledge, which was present in aid work, was shared with military partners. It also emphasized efforts to support female victims of terrorism, as groups increasingly use the tactic of sexual and gender-based violence, as seen with groups like Boko Haram or ISIS. The chapter on USAID as well really kind of highlights the tensions that came up with this label as well. And so the more that development and aid work was framed in relation to countering extremism, the greater the number of issues that came with that. And so these are just a snapshot of some of the practices that I outlined in the book. And I look at it in a lot more detail through the eyes and experiences of those that worked on those programs. What was perhaps most fascinating while I was looking at all of these years was what examining the role of women said about that broader campaign to counter terrorism since 9/11. And there are several concerns that became visible as I surveyed these, which speak to, I think, both past and ongoing concerns about how we counter terrorism today. So the first concern that came up was that in relation to an overarching US government counterterrorism strategy. So while it was evident that a comprehensive approach to terrorism has always been visible and articulated, there continued to be debates about who should lead this. How do you guide multiple agencies and streams in this whole of government approach? And really the emphasis on these different streams of effort in this. So the manner in which different policy issues related to counterterrorism were integrated into that cohesive strategy in each country of operation was not uniform in practice. And this really had broad implications for programming, particularly that which focused on women, which was often viewed as a secondary consideration. The second concern that came up was seen between those direct and indirect efforts in this whole of government approach. When I mean direct, I mean some of that more harder tip of the spear counterterrorism efforts and some of the more preventative work. So tension is bound to occur in any counterterrorism strategy which comprises multiple streams of effort and diverse actors and agencies who each come with their own history, mandates, and focus. But looking at direct and indirect streams of effort, how these were balanced and prioritized could be considered in terms of the significance and value that each stream appeared to hold in that comprehensive approach. So that balance between short and long-term objectives, between preventative work and dealing with the threat of the day, and competition for resources required to sustain each stream. The potential impacts of these streams of effort on each other also meant that each had to be cognizant of the implications of their work on other departments or agencies. The third limitation or concern that was raised was really what was said in policy discourses and how that translated to practice on the ground. So what became apparent was what was said in a statement, a national strategy, or even a doctrine does not always translate seamlessly through government departments and agencies into practice on the ground. And what was articulated or stated in that strategy or statement really had to be traced in its interpretation and implementation on the ground. So for example, the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Act. And the fourth was with the introduction of new roles for women, we also saw instrumentalized roles for women. And in some of these cases, women were engaged in counterterrorism efforts based on new roles that were developed for a specific task, purpose, or operational concern or objective. One example of this was increased positions available to female servicewomen in the DoD in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, where new units such as Team Lioness or female engagement teams or mixed gendered teams such as cultural support teams drew women from different backgrounds and established new positions within the DoD for them. So servicewomen in foreign countries, which had been previously limited in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, and Yemen, also took up new roles in the police and military forces. But in almost all of these, they faced resistance, they were faced discrimination, sporadic support along the way in establishing these roles. And really there were a lot of gendered assumptions and stereotypes within the setting up of many of these units. For fields previously seen outside of the security space, so again, things like political empowerment or education, programming related to that work really appeared to be instrumentalized or even securitized so as to bring women into contemporary security discourses or practices in that full spectrum of response. So here, things like the link between political empowerment and education became framed in new ways and gained relevance in the global war on terror. And this also brought concerns including access to funding or danger to employees and partners in the field if traditional development programs became framed in new ways in their nexus to countering terrorism. So I know we're running a little bit short on time here, so I will skip over what makes the book unique, besides just really encouraging you all to have a read of it. But there's a number of conclusions that I list here. But I do want to also, I think, highlight a couple of the issues that are relevant to this book when we're looking at counterterrorism today, and issues that kind of relate to this period, which are still ongoing. The first is the status of ISIS families and fighters who remain timely and are influenced by gendered assumptions. And so whether it's looking at the families that remain, there's about 10,000 foreigners who remain in northeast Syria, including 7,000 children. This remains an ongoing concern for countries around the world. And one that very much relates to things like gendered assumptions and stereotypes as they pertain to counterterrorism. There's also issues around things like the stripping of citizenship, which we saw in the UK with cases like Shamima Begum, one of the Bethnal Green girls who traveled when she was a teenager. And the repatriation, rehabilitation, and prosecution of women has also varied country to country, depending on their gendered views of women. There's also interesting questions now about the longevity, impact, and sustainability of some of the units that were set up and supported in this period. So, for example, we know that women in Kurdistan, so in Syria and Iraq, were on the front lines in the fight against ISIS. And so looking at what kind of long-term prospects there are for them, or in units like this all-elite female engagement, the all-elite counterterrorism unit in Yemen, which was initially dispersed after the Houthis took power. So there's a lot of interesting questions about the longevity of these programs and the kind of footprint that they have as well. And in the US, again, relating to some of the programs that were specifically established, female engagement teams, cultural support teams, and the kind of roles that they can play in the future. The real takeaway from this is that I think we have really fallen short in how we consider women and gender in all aspects of counterterrorism. And again, I frame this in terms of agents, partners, and targets. And what I really hope that the quick presentation today and that framework in particular does for you is gives you a kind of a tool to look at it in your own context and think a little bit more about how, where, and why, and with what implications women are being engaged in the space as agents, partners, and targets. So I thank you very much for letting me present today, and I look forward to your questions.
Dr. Cook, thank you so much for that incredible presentation. I actually just finished the book myself. It is very informative. I highly recommend everyone purchase it. I believe it's available on Amazon. And with that being said, I do have some preset questions I prepared, but I'm going to actually jump into the audience Q&A because they have some amazing questions as well. The first one coming from Ms. Stacy Gerlach. She asks, in your opinion, how much forward progress do you feel we have really made since 9/11?
I'm going to answer that through the agents, partners, and targets lens. And so if we're talking about women as practitioners in the field of counterterrorism, I think there's been some very positive changes. So whether it's opening up all combat positions to women, whether it's recognizing that when you're establishing a program in the State Department, you've got to think about how you engage with women in those local communities as well. Or how you can better consider things like gender dynamics when you're establishing CVE work. There has been progress made with women as practitioners and really in those programs. But I think one of the concerns I have is how institutional memory plays a role or not in this. And so I think there's important lessons that have been learned in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and lesser known or focused on case studies like Yemen that I really have a concern may just kind of fall off the map. And I really would, it would be a shame to see some of those hard learned lessons just kind of fall into the oblivion. When we talk about women as partners, I think there has been an increasing recognition that you do have to engage women in the communities that you're working with. So it can't just be a tick box exercise. And in fact, the value of engaging with those diverse populations in your programming really can speak to things like how effective they are at the end of the day, the longevity and success of those programs, how you can better understand local dynamics when establishing those partnerships and relationships. And that, again, has made some progress, which is great. But again, I kind of worry that lessons learned might kind of slip away unless those are really captured and pushed forward. And for women as targets, so women's roles in violence extremist organizations, there were a few prominent women in Al-Qaeda, which gained some recognition over the years. But we really saw this global mobilization under ISIS, which kind of brought to the forefront that women do play these very diverse roles in violent extremist groups themselves. Whether it was looking at the January 6th attacks on the Capitol, the program on extremism, George Washington University highlighted that about 16% of those charged with offenses were women as well. We see women present in, they're in far-right movements as well now. We see them in jihadist groups, we see them in far-right movements, we do see them in kind of broad organizations around the world. And again, while I think there's still a lot of stereotypes in there, and there's a lack of recognition now about the diverse roles that women play in new and emerging movements like the far right. ISIS really kind of forced countries around the world to really think more about the roles that women play in violent extremist groups.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Errol and myself, we work with a lot of former white supremacists and a lot of women. So yes, it's very interesting. The next question is from Calvin. He asks, what U.S. government agencies coordinate this global national effort? And he lists like CIA, FBI, NSA. So yes.
Yeah, so I think, I was looking very much at some of these specific country case studies. So whether it was Afghanistan, Iraq, or Yemen, I did prioritize looking at Department of Defense, Department of State, and USAID. But and that was because whether it was your national security strategies or your national strategies to combat terrorism, these three tended to play the most overt roles. But there's dozens of agencies throughout the US government that have a role in this. And so I looked at international efforts. So this doesn't even include things like domestic agencies like the FBI or the Department of Homeland Security. I didn't look at the CIA, but all of these, there's dozens. There's also judicial bodies that play significant roles in this space as well. I prioritize those three again very much because they, if you're looking at that international all of government approach, those three had the greatest coordination efforts. But I leave it at that. I mean, there's dozens of bodies around the U.S. government that have an important role to play in this.
Interesting. Our next question is from a SCI alum, Mr. Martin Figueroa. He asks, how do you think the approach to terrorism will change under Biden versus Trump? Yeah,
so this has been a really interesting one. And, I think there's going to be some things that stay the same, and I think there's going to be some things that change quite a bit. What was apparent between the Bush, Obama, and Trump administration is that continuity of an all-of-government approach. So each of these administrations has really stated that is an approach that is being taken, but the weight and balance of those streams of effort really diversified a lot. And I think under the Biden administration, there has been a more clear statement of intent to focus on the preventative work, so a lot more CVE work, and really trying to intervene, before you lessen that pool of people that might potentially go down the road of violent extremism. And so that does seem to be one of the ways that it is going to change under Biden. I've also seen a little bit more limitation in terms of things like drone strikes, and that is going to be another way, I think, for international counterterrorism efforts that it will change. But I think for all intents and purposes with my book, the women, peace, and security agenda and how that's really reflected in national security considerations, policies, practices, programming, there does seem to be a very strong indication as well from this administration that really thinking through how women and gender matter in this space is something that is going to be reflected a little bit more. But one of the cautions I raised in the book was really looking at what is said in a statement, what is said in in a speech, in a national security strategy, and what that actually ends up looking like on the ground. Because I think there does tend to be a bit of a gap between kind of big lofty statements and the actual kind of progress you see on the ground. So I think there's a lot to be seen, but I am hopeful that there's a lot of positive changes that'll come in this period. And I think the biggest one is going to be a much more serious focus on far-right extremism, particularly domestically.
Yes, excellent. So speaking on that, on International Women's Day, the Biden administration released an executive order on establishment of the White House Gender Policy Council. What are your thoughts on that and how it redefines the role of women in counterterrorism efforts?
Yeah, so again, I think this was a really another great move, another great initiative, but it really, to be seen, it really has to, we really have to see where that aid, what impact do they have, what access do they have, what kind of resources do they have behind them. If you're working with folks in the defense sector, if you're focusing, or if you're working with folks in the diplomatic sector, how seriously do they take those considerations, and how do they actually get integrated into the policies and practices and the everyday functioning of these organizations? So if you have a dedicated body that's sole job is to really look at how women and gender matter in the space of national security, this is great. But again, those follow-up questions about access, resources, longevity, and really how these programs and initiatives start changing on the ground, that's what I would really be keeping an eye on.
Thank you. So speaking to that again, do you believe that having a woman as a VP is a step in the right direction?
I think representation matters. You know, at the end of the day, you want an effective government. You want effective civil servants working in your, to keep your country safe and to advance the concerns of your country. But I do think that representation matters, and so seeing more and more women kind of take up leadership roles across government is very encouraging. We've still not seen a female Secretary of Defense. This was one of the years when there was maybe a possibility of that, but perhaps another year. But I think there's two components of that. Number one is the kind of representation, the visual representation that you have by having women in some of these leadership roles, but also the kind of champions that you would have at the very senior levels as well, who advance this agenda. So you don't necessarily have to be a woman to see the benefits or what contribution engaging that women, peace and security agenda or engaging gender considerations can have for your programming. So I think another important thing to look at is those kind of gender champions or senior leadership. And again, particularly in tough departments like the Department of Defense, where if you start talking about things like why gender matters, you can it's a pretty tough conversation to have sometimes. But if you have senior leadership really getting behind the agenda and demonstrating why it matters to helping your troops achieve their mission at the end of the day, then I think you're on a good path.
Excellent. Thank you. So we have a question from an anonymous question. Thinking about the future of warfare and homeland security as being tech and cyber-based, how can gender equality be better in the cyber STEM fields as actors and decision makers?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's not necessarily my field, but I think the areas that I would be really interested in looking at more are things like gender-based analysis when you're looking at these online networks, when you're looking at how these online communities, how gender is represented in them. Are gender considerations also integrated into your own programs? So do you have a gender conscious lens when you're looking at online violence extremist networks, when you're looking at how some of these narratives and discourses are translating country to country and group to group. But then within these forces themselves, I think the same kind of basic concept with things like policing, you want to represent the community you come from. And I think there's only strength to be had from departments and agencies which really kind of reflect the strengths and the diversity of the populations they serve. And that very much, there's a lot of fields that still is quite lacking. And I believe this is certainly one of them. And I think gender equality could a little bit more a gender conscious lens and a bit more gender equality within staffing is certainly something that I think could only bring benefits to that.
Thank you. So I believe we have time for maybe 2 more questions. I have one for you. Should women who are radicalized be able to return to society?
Yeah, this is a really tough question that a lot of politicians are facing these days, and I know the U.S. has taken a proactive effort in this space to repatriate U.S. women that were engaged with ISIS. I think that was completely the right move to make. What I've been arguing for, I've been looking at this issue since about 2013, and have been following the journeys of many of these women since they left in 2014. And I think it is absolutely correct that the governments do repatriate their citizens who did go over to Iraq and Syria and join groups like ISIS. For those that committed crimes over there, you try them to the full extent of the law, and you give justice to the victims that they may have suffered under. And for those that face different degrees of exploitation or abuse or coercion, you deal with those on a case-by-case basis as appropriate. For those domestically, absolutely. There's a lot of really good civil society organizations around the U.S. that work in this space too. And I know that your organization partners with many of them. But I do believe that, similar to other criminals, whether it's robbery, whether it's, other kind of illegal activities, the way that our justice systems are set up is that you face, the full extent of the law for the crimes that you've committed, but there is an opportunity to rehabilitate and return to society. And I don't think terrorism should be viewed as exceptional in that way. But I think one of the challenges that we do have is really looking at how you de-radicalize and rehabilitate and reintegrate some of these populations. Like this, it's a very new field still. So it has only been, in countries like Germany, it's been going on for a much longer period of time. But I think in the West, it is something that's really kind of come to the forefront, particularly after, again, 2014. And there's still a lot of shortfalls and limitations in that, and a lot of things like gender dynamics within that, are thinking about how you would, with the de-radicalization program, are there specific things related to a woman, maybe who's a single young mother, or somebody who's a 65-year-old woman who went and joined one of these groups, that might be different than dealing with an 18-year-old young man that went and joined a group and became a militant, right? So there's a lot of kind of nuances in the very diverse actors that join these groups as well. And that does have to be reflected in programming. And I think that's still somewhere where we're falling short.
Thank you. So one more anonymous attendee, they ask, in a perfect world, if you could direct or write U.S. policy, how would you rewrite the role of women in counterterrorism efforts?
So I think the biggest thing that I would do is gender-based analysis. So really include gender-based analysis in everything you do. So whether that's who you're hiring, whether that's how you're developing programming, whether that's how you're interjecting with communities at risk, really being conscious of, and again, I use that kind of agents, partners, and targets lens. What does that gender-based analysis mean for how you engage women as partners in this space, as soldiers, as diplomats, as aid workers, as women in community-based organizations that can support this work? What does this mean for women in local communities that you're working with? How does that gender-based analysis inform how we understand terrorist groups and the diverse roles that people play within that? It's not necessarily my field. It's one of great interest to me, though. But when you're doing gender-based analysis, there's still a great association that gender means women, which is completely incorrect. And so if you apply that gender-based analysis, it also helps us better understand why young men go and join these organizations as well. Or gender-based analysis helps us better understand how you can support, even men in de-radicalization programming, or why they may join these groups in the first place, what motivations they might have. So gender-based analysis, I think, and gender-informed analysis in all areas of this work would really better help us identify and think through the very, very diverse roles that all persons play in these groups, and in efforts to respond to them. It's a bit of a broad answer, but if I were to kind of wave my wand, that was, I think, probably one of the biggest things I would do.
Excellent. And I absolutely agree. Last question. What else are you working on right now?
Well, there's a lot going on right now. So I'm working with Dr. Shiraz Maher at the International Center for the Study of Radicalization. We're doing an edited volume looking at Islamist governance. So looking at how many different Islamist groups around the world have approached governance. And this includes a lot of non-state actors like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Boko Haram. And so thinking through that, I'm also working with a colleague at the Program on Extremism, soon to be Dr. Deborah Margolin, I hope. And we're looking at a review of the state of the field on women in terrorism. So really, it's a big year. So it's 20 years since 9/11. It's 50 years since this field of terrorism studies really started taking off. So we're taking a bit of an account of the field.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Cook. This was absolutely incredible. I'm going to pass it back to Errol to quickly close, and just thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you both for an incredible First of all, Dr. Cook, thank you for an incredible presentation. Jesse, just really interesting questions, especially from the audience as well as yours. So I could not think of a better conversation or text, especially on the 20th anniversary of 9/11. So Dr. Cook, thank you for your work. Thank you for your continued efforts. Actually, I'm going to, in interest of full disclosure, Jesse brought you to my attention. So Jesse, thank you for that. I'm going to close with just thanking everyone for being with us today. And I'd like to let you know we're going to be hosting a women's empowerment event on March 31st. The panel at this point is going to consist of Miriam Churchill, who's the Executive Director for Parents for Peace, an organization that we at the Safe Communities Institute work with, which is an organization that's global of parents who have children who've been in extremist organizations around the world. Mona Curry, who's the Emergency Manager with the Los Angeles Police Department. We have our good friend Ariella Lowenstein, who's the Associate Director for the Pacific Southwest Division for the Anti-Defamation League, who we work very closely with. And last but not least, Chief Leslie Ramirez, who is the LA Unified School Police Chief. So if you could join us on March 31st, you can look at all the events and all the information that we have on our site, which is sci.usc.edu. Again, Dr. Cook, thank you for your work. Thank you for being with us today. Jesse, thank you for an incredible job you do every day at the Safe Communities Institute and for moderating this event. And to all of you, have a very healthy and safe day. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Dr. Cook.